Hey guys, what's up? It's Rauta. It's time for a classic review. Now, a while ago I reviewed the latest Watain album, The Agony of Ecstasy of Watain, and so far it's my album of the year. So that kind of gave me an idea to revisit one of their early albums, actually the debut album, Rabid, Death's Curse. And as you previously might have already known, and this is the habit I have, whenever something more, say, achieved band releases a new album, it's nice to revisit some of the early works in comparison and to give a little bit of an idea how it was going way before. So now we tune in all the way to year 2000, 22 years ago, when Watain from Sweden released their very first album. Now, going in a little bit of memory lane, this is something that I remember acquiring quite fresh. I remember that was around the time when I was often quite, like every month or so, I was actually buying albums quite blindly. That is based on sheer description. There was no YouTube or whatever. Just albums from Northern Heritage Distribution and stuff like that. And one of those albums was Rabid, Death's Curse. Can't really say for sure nowadays if it was 2000 or 2001 or so, but that was before the second album. So that was kind of my first contact point with the Swedish band. That was basically, no one had heard it before. I mean, they had demos and whatever, but kind of a given. Underground was quite different back in the days. I mean, really, you didn't have Spotify, YouTube, or whatever, so you basically either, still tape trading or buying albums quite blindly based on sheer description. And this would fit right in that bill in the terms of like, okay, it's black metal from Sweden, I guess kind of a raw end, grim or whatever, and that's how I got it, among the others. As you can see, I'm not showing a physical product here because I don't really have it anymore. And there's a reason. But I had to kind of revisit that reasoning I had back in the days, getting rid of that CD, like, what if I did the wrong thing? I mean, sometimes it really happens. Now, Watain as a band is very different nowadays than what it used to be in early 2000s. Not so much of the themes, not so much of the lineup, because those things have more or less, I guess, come along with the band throughout these 20 plus years. But what's going on in terms of music is quite different these days. So it was indeed quite fun to revisit these albums for a few spins here and there, driving a car, going to the gym, going for walks and whatever, and kind of a ponder what made this album tick back in the days and how the band has actually evolved since those days. Now, obviously, because back in 2000, where it was a little bit different place. I mean, of course, the scene was a little bit different and everybody was a lot of younger. And of course, that kind of reflects the music as well. Now, Watain's debut album is interesting combination of very Swedish things in terms of black metal. It's kind of a raw, the production is still quite raw, but definitely not bad. And the combination of riffs and songwriting is, in a way, a little bit of a hit and miss. Not so much maybe miss section in like, okay, this is mediocrity, because I think this album is way beyond that. But it's not as great as the best albums by the band later on. And this is something that I try to, dismantle a little bit. Now, this is a curious combination because there's a lot of dissection parts throughout Watain's course of history. Some of those catchier melodies and, I guess, softer parts in a way are something like reminiscent of what Dissection was doing. Now, Watain's first album doesn't really have those elements too much, but they are very much present. So one can only guess how much influence Dissection might have had on Watain. I mean, it's kind of a given. Storm for Light's Bane is one of those 10 out of 10 albums for me, so I would totally understand if that album was one of the igniters or inspirations for their debut album as well. But what I didn't really remember that this was more like a mix and match kind of a thing in terms of a black metal album. First of all, like you do have this kind of raw end of production, but it's not like this is super primitive or anything like that. I mean, you really can't compare this to, say, Iljarn or early Graveland. This is kind of a more polished in those terms. This is not like Arcanum from Sweden, but definitely still on the raw end, especially when you start comparing this to the later Watain albums. But when you combine all those riffs, it's kind of interesting how much Nordic feeling it has, yet without sounding totally Swedish like so many other bands, which really do sound all the way through very Swedish. I mean, you have those certain kind of melodies and you have the certain kind of songwriting part, which is just totally Swedish. But Watain is a little bit off. I mean, they have their own kind of a thing going on, but at the same time, you can really inhale those parts where it's all dissection. Or Marduk, like some of those riffs. For example, this self-titled track here, Rabid Death's Curse, the track number 2. It's kind of curious because, first of all, it kind of has those Marduk parts, which are not that great. I mean, not even close to Marduk's best parts, but the kind of a medium Marduk, if you will. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, they want to play their black metal fast and furious ways, and at the same time, kind of balancing these more fierce parts with the rather softer, melodic, catchier parts. There are also riffs which, in my opinion, remind of Mayhem's debut album, The Mysteries of Sathanas. And The Mysteries of Sathanas is, in my opinion, one of the best black metal albums of all time. So, kind of a given that any decent band would just get inspired by that one. Now, when you have got all these parts, this kind of a combination of Marduk, Dissection, Mayhem, and what have you, now that is what leads to Rabid Death's Curse. But it doesn't really sound like that because, for example, Dissection and Mayhem sound so much more polished and clearer, crispier, if you will, versus what Watain was doing. I mean, in that sense, it kind of reminds more of that Marduk side, but maybe even a little bit more grim than typical Marduk one. Now, those three bands plus who knows what are now being stirred into this huge pot called Watain, and then you do a little bit stirring and you let it boil for, like low energy or whatever, and that boils to be what this album is all about. A lot of traditional kind of early 90s or mid 90s kind of a black metal, and that happens in the year 2000. I mean, obviously it was recorded before that, so basically, technically speaking, it's actually very 1990s album, but of the later era. Now, I remember seeing Watain a few years later than when this happened, when they were still quite an underground band, and they already had fierce shows. So their music was backed up with a really cool live presence, and I mean, you could smell the kind of somewhat decayed blood or whatever, and those guys would, be no clowns. They would be fierce. They would be dangerous, and they would have this element like, this is not gonna be some nice party, for family and shit. This is gonna be some real deal evil black metal, which then again complemented the whole music here. And of course, Watain started to evolve from that point. I mean, the first album and all that stuff. Now, in hindsight, I must say, this album is far from being Watain's best, but it's still quite a solid album. I mean, it could be a lot better when you really think about it, individual riffs and songwriting and all that stuff, but it's kind of a given that it was a debut album. You kind of have to make those, I'm not going to say the mistakes, but you kind of have to experiment and see where it goes. So it could have been a lot worse. In my opinion, this is a decent album, but far from being a great one. And it was nice to kind of revisit this for a few spins, but now I kind of understand why I sold or traded, cannot really remember for sure, this years and years ago. An interesting album for sure, but kind of also it's nice to see how the band evolved and changed to something more mainstreamish. And not saying that like that was a bad thing, just more approachable, if you will. So, Watain's debut album, interesting, but not the best of the band, not even close. Definitely worth giving a shot if you haven't heard it, or if you have missed it in other ways, or, I mean, if you haven't been listening to it for a while. Kind of a different, but at the same time you can still hear those roots. So there it is. Take a look. It's available on your favorite streaming services, most likely anyway. So that should go hand in hand with the new one, and you can do a little bit of comparing. This is Rauta. Take care and see you soon with more classic reviews coming your way.